My name is Christie Purifoy, and it's my great privilege today as writer-in-residence here at Church of the Good Samaritan to introduce our guest. His pen is full of grace. Father Malcolm Guite is an Anglican priest, a poet, an academic, a singer-songwriter. He is the author of many, many books, including especially collections of sonnets, like Sounding the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year, as well as works on the really vital intersection of theology and the arts. He writes seriously and prolifically, but lives, I think, joyfully. I recently read a wonderful essay in which he celebrates the rich pleasures of blowing rings, pipe smoke.
Yes.
Smoke
rings from my pipe.
Yes. And apparently his bandmates in Cambridge call him the Rockin' Rev. Father Guite, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be here. It was so encouraging to worship with you this morning. You know, this really good, big, vigorous congregation, clearly fully into what they were doing. It was, I know, obviously, it's also wonderful for me if I can get communion on the road. I really value it. So I was very much in need of that this morning. Thank you for letting me join you.
Father, I wonder if you would tell us, just to, as we begin, a little bit about your journey to Christ, perhaps the role poetry played in that journey, and your twin vocations as priest and poet.
Oh my goodness,
yeah.
How long have you got? So it was a journey to Christ. It was a return to the Christ who had always held me. I was fortunate to be born into a Christian household. Though my Methodist local preacher father and my Presbyterian mother may still, even in heaven, be puzzled at how they produced this Anglican son, but there you go. So yeah, I was brought up in a household of faith. It was also a household of both scholarship and poetry. My father was a professor of classics, but the poetry side of my life and work and vocation very much comes down, as it were, the female line in my family. My mother had a vast fund of poetry, which just welled out from her, and she quoted poems from memory just in ordinary everyday life. She would, we used to travel back and forth from Africa to England each year when my dad had his academic leave, and I'd look out from the boat and see a lovely, white-sailed sailing ship, and I'd say, "Gee, Mom, that's a pretty boat. I wonder where it's going," And she'd put her arm around me and say, "Whither, O splendid ship, thy white sails crowding, leaning across the bosom of the urgent west, that fearest nor sea rising nor sky clouding? Whither away, fair rover, and what thy quest?" I go, "Yeah, that," I didn't realize this wasn't a thing. Like, I was mainly at home for a lot of time. When I was about 6 or 7, I finally went to a school where I met other kids. I was talking to this other kid, and I said, "You know that thing when your mum recites the whole of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? And it's great because it's just before bedtime, and it's going to go on, He said, "What thing?" I said, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the thing that mums do." And I had no idea that everybody's mum didn't do that. So I now, the more I look back, the more I see that poetry. She didn't sit me in a corner and say, "Now this is poetry, you must have 10, it's good for you, have 10 minutes of it before playtime." It just flowed naturally, so much so that I didn't know what it was. But anyway, there came a point when I was in my, I suppose it was about 71, so I was maybe 12 or 13, that we were living in Canada at that point, but my dad felt I was losing my British identity, which was a bit of a joke, really, because, I'd been born in Nigeria, lived in Zimbabwe, whatever. But anyway, he sent me to a boarding school in England, which was very good from the academic point of view. It's mainly a day school, but the boarding side of it was pretty dysfunctional and miserable, and, you only have to read, C.S. Lewis or half the English writers who tell you what boarding schools were like. So I was very homesick. I was sort of suffering. I kind of lost my faith. I tried to go for a very bleak, sort of reductive view of the world. I went completely the other way. We're just unwinding enzymes. This iron laws of physics mean that everything that happens in our brain is already, predetermined. All that. It's just a matter of the cold catenation of meaningless atoms in the void kind of thing. And then somehow the poetry side of things kept coming up, and I had a sort of transformative experience when I was 16, reading Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, actually in Keats's house. And it was such a transcendent experience that I rejected the complete materialism. I thought, I'm sure there were synapses firing and neurons going on, but that was not the sum of it. This is not reducible. There is an overplus, an overbrim, a kind of mysterious pleroma coming out of this art of poetry, which cannot be accounted for internally in terms of the immanent frame. It took me a while to get from there to faith in God, and God had to intervene in various ways. I had a kind of experience reading the Psalms of his presence, and eventually, I came to understand that he was meeting me in Christ, and there were various steps along the way. I mean, for me, it was both a spiritual journey, but it was also an intellectual journey. I'd been persuaded that science was the case, and that the science somehow disproved Christianity, which I now know it doesn't in the least, and that all truth is on the side of the one who said, I am the truth, the way, and the life. But it took me a while. I had a few helpful experiences along the way in Cambridge. I was thinking really hard about these things. I was studying English, but I did a bit of philosophy as well, and I was reading Plato. But I was also beginning to read St. Paul, and just as texts that you should know. And I stopped in the street once and thinking really hard about how in Plato you're trying to aspire from out of the many, from this mere world of change and chance and temporality, into the true, the eternal, the unchanging beauty of the perfected forms. And I found that very attractive. But then I was reading, Philippians, and find, though he was found in form equal to God, he did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself. How would one who was already there want to come? So I was puzzling over these things. And I was puzzling over them so hard I once stopped in the street and therefore formed an obstruction. And the poor chap who was walking behind me, who was a young faculty member, young fellow of one of the Cambridges, bumped into me. And I said, I'm so sorry, I was thinking. And he said, instead of saying, get out of my way, you ache, he said, what were you thinking? And I said, well, if you really want to know, I was thinking about Plato and Christ, and here's the problem. So we stood there and he's listening, and he says, do you know you're not the first person to have asked that question? And he said, have you ever read anything by Origen or Chrysostom? And I said, no, I don't even know who they are. He said, well, you should. And then he gave me his card and said, if you want to pop round and have a chat, about these things, please do. And I put the card in my pocket. And later when I was, getting some money out to buy a pint, I found the card and I read it, and it said Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams, tutor in doctrine at Westcott House. I mean, he was, this is, we're talking about 1978, 79 now. So I went round and had a chat. Bloody hell, One thing he changed, I realized that there was no way you could ever say Christianity is for dummies, when you're having a conversation. So he became, something of a friend and helper, and I was very blessed in that way. And eventually, in my final year as an undergraduate, I came back to a full sort of Trinitarian faith. And I was confirmed. Rowan preached, in fact, rather than the bishop, because, it was just, you've got him there. I was confirmed in February of 1980, so I became a communicant Anglican then and have been ever since. About 10 years later, I felt the vocation to priesthood and tested that in various ways. And at first, when I thought God was calling to do this, part of my resistance to it was I looked at the clergy of the Church of England as I had happened to encounter them. And with the exception of Rowan, I couldn't see anybody who remotely looked like me. But then I discovered John Donne and George Herbert, and I figured, okay, if there was room for those guys, maybe there's room for me. And in a way, the early vocation to be a poet, which started in Keats' house when I was 16, I want to be that. And the vocation to be a priest became closer and closer, and eventually I perceived that they were, in fact, two aspects of the same vocation, and that I would lead and celebrate liturgy as a poet and realize that this is a great transformative poem into which we enter, but that I would also write poetry as a priest, and that there would be a sacramental and a pastoral aspect to that. So eventually they came together. It took a while.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to have a bit of conversation around imagination, and then maybe come back to the specific creative, imaginative art of poetry. But I was struck in your sermon this morning, keeping in mind that many of you here haven't yet had the privilege of hearing Father Guite preach yet. You will after this class, but we know that you're preaching on Job, and you talked about Job making that move from hearing, having heard of God, to seeing. Yeah. And for those of us who want to take that journey and see God, perhaps the way Job, to see, can imagination help us? Is imagination an eye?
It certainly can. We should free ourselves of the fairly recent modern notion that imagination is only about the imaginary, it's only about making stuff up. Although it is true that when you make stuff up, you can find and communicate enormous truths, just read The Lord of the Rings, but imagination is also, certainly according to Coleridge, part of how we perceive. C.S. Lewis put it beautifully. He said, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. It's how we know. But the poet who put it best, unsurprisingly, is Shakespeare. And he really makes the case in Midsummer Night's Dream for imagination as a way of knowing, as a faculty that is truth-bearing. He says, the poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, so it doesn't get more comprehensive than that. And as imagination, this is the extraordinary thing, as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, so the real things, including the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the fact that you may not know them in the way you'd like to know them yet doesn't mean they're not true. There would be no science and no discoveries if existence and what we know were coterminous. There's unknown things to know. And just as we create scientific instruments by which we can bring into focus distant stars or whatever, so the capacity of the imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing. It's not really nothing, but it's something we haven't been able to get hold of yet. Gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And in that same speech, he uses the two words, two different kinds of knowing, to apprehend something, just about reach out towards it, and to comprehend it. And he says that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. We kind of sense things before we fully know them, and we may need to sense them in order to know them. Coleridge thought about that a great deal. In fact, Coleridge went further. He thought that the imagination shapes things in collaboration with God himself and with God the Spirit. He said, the primary imagination, he said, is the primary agent of all human perception and is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So there's a deep theology to be had there. But anybody who's loved a poem or a work of art will have had the experience of going back again and again to the same poem and the same work of art and learning more, finding yet more inside it. It's finite, yet it gives something access to something infinite. Now that principle, which is right at the heart of the arts, of imagination bodying forth a form so that now you can begin to comprehend, begin to know something that would have been fleeting, something of heaven, if you like, is wooed into the earth. That idea, I think when Shakespeare writes that, I think he is quietly riffing on the prologue to John's Gospel. That the ultimate bodying forth, the ultimate making known of what could otherwise be unknown, of making accessible and comprehensible to us the infinite mysteries of God's infinite love in heaven, the ultimate bodying forth is the incarnation. And just as the poet's eye glances from heaven to earth and earth to heaven, imagination bodies forth. So we see the heaven in the beginning of that prologue. The Word was with God, the Word was God, in him was life, there was the light of men, all of that. But you're going, well, great, I'm sure this is wonderful, high philosophical theology, but I don't get it. And then suddenly comes John 1:14. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. We beheld it, we saw it. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So everything that Christ is in heaven in his eternal mode, he bodies forth for us in his body on earth, in his body in one another, in the body and blood that some of us have just received, others will receive later this morning. And I think all poetic embodiment depends on and is underpinned by that great poetic embodiment, which is the triune poet himself.
So maybe that is the answer to this question, which is, can we trust our imaginations? We modern people, we like the facts and the lists.
This is why we need, C.S. Lewis introduces us to the idea of a baptized imagination. He feels that by reading George MacDonald, in some way, his imagination was baptized. Now, baptism involves both death and resurrection. We're baptized into Christ's death as well. To be baptism itself, going under the water and come up, is a mimesis of death and resurrection. There's definitely something we leave to be. We offer everything to God, and then he raises it up again after it's been offered to him. And because we're fallen, our imagination, just like every other faculty, is shadowed and can go dark and could turn in on itself and can produce falsehoods. When I make the case for the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty, I'm not saying everything you imagine is true, but I'm saying you'll never know what the truth is unless your imagination is brought to bear on it. Okay? If you love the Lord with all your God and love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, then somewhere in mind, heart, and soul is imagination, and you're giving that to God. So I think the imagination needs to be baptized. I think it needs to be brought to Christ. But I think by God's grace and the work of his Spirit and the fact that he is the light which lightens everyone that comes into the world, I think there are lots of examples of poets and artists who, with the top of their heads, might be atheist or agnostic, but whose baptized imaginations... Lewis says in Surprised by Joy, effectively says, in a way, my imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me took a bit longer to catch up. And that's exactly my story. And so he's a hard-boiled 16-year-old atheist when he says his imagination was baptized. So, God can play along on this. And I think, in my book, Faith, Hope and Poetry, I've got a chapter called Doubting Faith and Reticent Hope, in which I specifically look at the work of poets who didn't think they were Christians, but whose work, in fact, seems to be available to the Spirit. And even poets who, I think I give the example, I can probably call it to mind. So Thomas Hardy, mainly known as a novelist, but not a cheerful novelist, I have to say. It's not, I'm going to have such a gladsome mind reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles. But, rather unfairly, G.K. Chesterton once called Thomas Hardy the village atheist brooding on the village idiot. But you read those novels because you recognize that he understands the deepest passions and both sufferings and hopes and frustrations of what it is to be human. So you read it, and he's a truth-telling novelist. But he then, towards the end of his life, after the death of his wife, he started writing poetry. And in the poetry, he tries to carry on being grim old atheistic, Thomas Hardy. But there's something in the poetry that won't quite let him do that. So a classic example of that is his poem, A Darkling Thrush, which he wrote on the very last day of the 19th century. So it's about to be the 20th century. He's looking at it saying, it's not good, And he uses all the kind of Hardyisms in this poem. So the poem begins, I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey. The winter's dregs made desolate the weakling eye of day. The tangled bine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. So you've got, bleak, desolate, all the rest of that. And he goes on like that for another verse, the land's sharp features seem to be the century's corpse outlent. The clouds, his cryptic canopy, the wind, his death lament. And he goes on like that. And then you think the poem is going to end, and then suddenly he confesses something. He says in the final verse, when all at once there rose among the bleak twigs overhead a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited, an aged thrush, small, gaunt and frail, in blast-beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the gathering gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things, afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy midnight air some blessed hope, whereof he knew, and I was unaware. Isn't that an amazing poem? It's wonderful to end a poem with such supreme awareness, with the word unaware. And he doesn't say I did. He's like, I'm not saying I did think so. I could think. There trembled through, nothing to see here. But the secret is out already. He has heard. And he realizes it's not terrestrial. There's little cause for carolings. But do you notice when he wants to talk about this transcendent experience that came to him in spite of all his, he has to borrow the language of faith. He has to borrow the language of the church. The evensong that he was studiedly not going to, he knew it was there. And when he reached for the meaning of the song of the thrush, he needed to borrow that liturgical word, evensong. And so many of the other words, joy illimited, blessed hope. And I found that in university. There's loads of so-called atheists who, when it comes to the point, actually need religious language. And they borrow it, and at least we're making it available to them. At least we're kind of keeping the door open for them. And eventually they'll want to know where that came from. And it's extraordinary, the paradox. So I was once present when Richard Dawkins, the author of The Selfish Gene and The God Delusion, was being interviewed. And the interviewer did a great thing. So the interviewer says to Richard Dawkins, Professor Dawkins, what is the meaning of life? And he says, the replication of DNA. And then immediately she asks him the next, says, do you want any music at your funeral? And he said, yes, Bach's B minor mass. Go figure. Selfish genes don't need Bach's B minor mass, but human souls do.
It seems as if the world is all about prose, but the church has so much poetry to offer. I wonder if you would talk more about, of course, it's the actual poems by yourself and other priest poets, but what does it look like for our witness in the world to be poetic and imaginative?
I think it's essential. I think one of the particular gifts of the Anglican tradition is the tradition of the priest poet, that goes right back. It's there in the early generations. It's there in John Donne and George Herbert, and later Robert Herrick. When the great revival comes in the Oxford movement, you suddenly have John Keble writing The Christian Year, a poem for every Sunday of the year. In the 20th century, you get R.S. Thomas, who's a really important witness, I think. So in a sense, when I was trying to feel my way into what my vocation was, at least there was a pattern there that I could look to. I could see that the notion of the priest poet was something available. In fact, my first encounter with George Herbert, who I would regard as the supreme exemplar, came through a little anthology, again, while I was still an agnostic, put together by R.S. Thomas. So it was one priest poet introducing another priest poet to somebody who would eventually become a third priest poet. So that's really important. And I think it's true in the specifically Christian literary tradition, but in the wider literary tradition. George MacDonald wrote a wonderful book about English poetry called England's Antiphon, in which he suggested that the great poets going back to Chaucer and coming forward, they shouldn't be strung out chronologically and separated and isolated into periods, because we hear them contemporarily. They're all contemporary to us as we read them. And he said they're much more like the choir in a chapel on either side. They're singing antiphonally to one another. That what one of the poets has said, the other poet hears and picks up and sings back. And I took that to the sort of nth degree in George Herbert's poem Prayer, which I think is one of the finest poems in the English language, and It's a sonnet, but it's not even a sentence. It's this cascade of 26 different beautiful images of what prayer is, followed by the modest statement, something understood. You know, it begins prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, Christian plummet. And in the end, I wrote 27 sonnets responding to just that one sonnet, because there was so much in it. I wrote a sequence called After Prayer. And so many of the phrases from that sonnet have entered into our thought, really. Heaven in ordinary, for example. That's a very George Herbert thing. The other thing that Herbert and the other poets give us is a quality both of honesty and of the language of the heart. It's the heart speaking, it's not just the head speaking. And it's not just the heart kind of indulging itself. It's the heart and the head coming together. It's thought and feeling mixed. And there's something very honest and very inclusive about Herbert. I was preaching this morning about Job and about how important it is that the Bible gives us the book of Job and gives us the Psalms and gives us not only the space for lamentation, but the very language with which we lament, and allows us to ask all the questions that we thought were forbidden, and gives us an example of somebody who will not let go of God, but who also needs God to know how they're feeling, and then I believe Job just... So there's a very short poem of Herbert's called Bittersweet, which just goes like this. And here's honesty for you. Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost strike, yet help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve. And all my sour sweet days I will lament and love. Both and. I will lament and love. And that seems to me to be a fully human response to a God who has become fully human for us, and who is going to raise us in our humanity and yet glorify us, in a way we can scarcely imagine. He will change us from glory to glory. And part of the glory, I think, will be our transfigured sufferings, now made radiant in glory.
I know we'd love to hear you read a few poems, maybe if you're willing, as you open up your books. I feel like I should at least remind us all that we belong to a church where the name that we have been given, some might say it was a figment in the imagination of Jesus. We're named for one of Jesus's stories, his imaginative parables. Of course, when we say figment of imagination, we're trying to put imagination in its place, which is over here. So we know that's not the right way now to talk about imagination. But I wonder, too, what you would say to us as a church named for a story.
To be called the Good Samaritan is brilliant. I also like the way you called Good Sam, I didn't realize this. I had these various emails going back and forth. I see Good Sam is going to have you preaching twice and stuff like that. I say, I'd love to meet Good Sam. Give him a good piece of my mind. But, I realized it was Good Samaritan. And obviously that's lovely. I mean, I've got in my book, Lifting the Veil, I've got a whole chapter on Christ and the moral imagination. And the parable of the Good Samaritan is obviously... maybe, actually, I think I have a poem about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here it is, oh, wow. Okay, so this is in a sequence called Parable and Paradox, and it's about the sayings of Jesus. And obviously I wanted to... I do some of the really hard sayings, but obviously I felt like I have to do the greatest hits as well. And, and the thing about the Good Samaritan is that we forget the force of it because it's so familiar. And a lot of this poetry was about recovering that. So you can imagine we've just heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think of all the churches, this is one I don't need to tell you that story. I take it you know it. How do we hear again the force of this? Since Good Samaritan slips off the tongue, as comfortable a phrase as any is, worn smooth because we've heard it for so long. Who is my neighbor? We don't need to ask. We know that we already know the answer. We know the duty, but we shun the task. Fear of the other grips us like a pincer. What if they crossed our path, these refugees? Who'd meet the cost when needs just multiply? We fear these questions and our spirits freeze. It's easier to turn and walk on by. Cross over to us, whose dark paths are crossed. Samaritan, whose cross defrays all costs. So, thank you. The turn of that poem is driven by a particular insight into the Gospels, which I first learned from St. Augustine, but I think lots of other church fathers say this. Jesus always is the kingdom that he tells the parables about. And Jesus never at any point asks us to do something that he himself does not do, and that he himself can, in fact, do in us. So there's a long reading of the good parable of the Good Samaritan, not simply as go and be a good neighbor, but that Christ is the Good Samaritan. That the point is it is humanity itself which has been robbed when we were robbed of Eden by the devil, and we're thrown out, and we're beaten up on the road and left for dead. And a lot of people feel like that. And all the previous religions of the world and the high-mindedness and the super cleanliness and all of that, the priest and the Levite actually pass by the wounded person. The person really beaten up is ignored by that until Christ comes. And Christ doesn't just cross the road, he crosses the gulf between heaven and earth. He comes, and then he finds us, and he pours wine and oil into our wounds. Why he gives us wine, pours oil into our wounds? Because those are the sacraments of chrism and our baptism and of communion. And he lifts us up, and he sets us on his own beast, because now he has made the human body his beast too. And then he takes us to an inn, right? And this is where I love the early church for this reason. They said, well, the inn is clearly the church. I just like that. Our first model is to be a really welcoming hostelry. So he sets up, it takes us to a place where we can be looked after and nourished and given cheer and good fellowship. And then he says to the innkeeper, the tab is on me. Here's what's needed, and the 2 coins are sometimes seen as again, the sacraments. And then he says, if he runs up a bigger tab, don't worry about it, I'm going to cover it all when I come back. And Christian said, that's what he said to us. He's got this covered. He is coming back. He's going to pick up the tab. We can be as generous as we like because his generosity is covering everything in the end. And that's all in that story. So that's how at the end I turn it around and I call Christ the Samaritan. And I say, cross over to us, whose dark paths are crossed. Samaritan, whose cross defrays all costs. That's where that's coming from. Maybe I'll just read 1 or 2 of these other ones on the sayings of Jesus to you. So that call to give imaginatively, generously, I remember I was writing a poem on the bit in Matthew 5:42, give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. And I was kind of channeling my inner doubting Thomas in a lot of these poems and going, oh yeah, sure, yeah, as if. And so I wanted to write this poem called As If, which is going to be like that, as if. But then as I was listing all these impossible things, as if, there was a line that suddenly came, as if my debts and sins were all forgiven. And I went, oh, wait a moment, they are. And then I suddenly realized all the other as ifs. Well, I'll read you the poem and I'll just say something briefly about it afterwards. So, as if. The giver of all gifts asks me to give, the fountain from which every good thing flows, the life who spends himself that all might live, the root whence every bud and blossom grows, calls me, as if I knew no limitation. As if I focused all his hidden force, to be creative with his new creation, to find my flow in him, my living source, to live as if I had no fear of losing, to spend as if I had no need to earn, to turn my cheek as if it felt no breezing, to lend as if I needed no return, as if my debts and sins were all forgiven, as if I too could body forth his heaven. Now, when I was writing that poem, I had this feeling that the poem was being, as it were, haunted by another poem, that it was in kind of conversation with another poem, which is both a great poem, but for me a problematic poem. And I couldn't work out what it was. I just carried on writing my poem. And then it was only at the end I suddenly realized what it was. And it clarified something about the gospel for me when I realized this. So the other poem, I've got this, as if, this list I have here of, to live as if I had no fear of losing, to spend as if I had no need to earn, to turn my cheek as if it felt no bruising, to lend as if I needed no return. What is going on? And I suddenly realized it was being haunted by Britain's favorite poem, which is because Britain is full of Pelagians. So the Britain's favorite poem is If by Rudyard Kipling. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a great poem, okay? It's got some individually fantastic lines. I mean, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, yeah, I've been there. If you can walk with kings nor lose the common touch, or talk with crowds, it is a long series of ifs, right? And it builds and builds and builds. And then it comes to that rather strange and I think kind of chilling end. Here's the end of that poem. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, now you've fulfilled all these conditions, if, you've done them all. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the world and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Now, why do I find that chilling? Because this is supremely the poem of conditional love. The father figure here is saying, well, let's see if you're good enough to be my son, eh? Here's a list of conditions upon which I'm not even going to call you a son or a man until you do this. And this is just the kind of attitude which, let's breed, send forth the best you breed, these are the people who are going to go and run the British Empire, right? And that was kind of Kipling's attitude to his kind of adoring sons who wanted to be like Dad, until one of them was killed in the First World War. And the father came to repent and wrote the little epitaph for everyone who died in that war. If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. Yeah? Now, he wrote that, and I mean, and I suddenly thought, that is so exactly the opposite of the gospel that it helps me to see what the gospel is. And this is why I wrote as if, in the end. My heart knew this before my head knew it. That God doesn't wait for us to do all these great things for him in the kingdom. He treats us as if we'd already done it. He forgives us already. He treats us as if we were already fully glorified in heaven. He looks at us in our baptism and says, you are my beloved, I delight in you. And however much we screw things up, he still sees the resplendent image that he put in us shining forth. And he not only treats us as if all those things are already achieved, but he says, go and live as if they were. Just give it a go. Imagine it. Go for it. I'm going to love you fully, whatever happens. Yeah. So, there's no risk. Just go for it. Live as if.
Go and do likewise.
Go and do likewise, yeah. Yes. Go and do likewise. And that's so
wonderful.
How are we off for time?
We're right at time. We have another service.
Okay, can I just do one last one?
That'd be wonderful.
I'll read you one more. So obviously I did, I as well as doing obscure ones, I thought I've got to do, the greatest hit. So I realized it's a very popular verse in America. I was, for the first time in Texas years ago, and we were driving, I was being driven out to a Western wear store, and there was this big pickup truck, pickup trucks everywhere. There was one in front of us, and it had a gun rack in the back, with these rifles in it. And it had 2 bumper stickers. And the first one was, don't mess with Texas. And the second one was, John 3:16. And I just thought, something got lost in translation there. So I went back and I did check the Greek. And so I'm going to find my one. It's John 3:16. Let me find it here. Oh, golly. Come on, so love the world. You can never find the thing when you're
I know.
Oh, here we are, page 33. Okay, so if you go back to the Greek, it's fantastic. When it says God so loved the world, the love word there is agape, and the world there is ton kosmon, the cosmos. God so agaped the cosmos. So I'll close with this. The whole round world, in Greek, the total cosmos, is all encompassed in this loving word. Not just the righteous, right on, and religious, but everyone of whom you've ever heard, and all the throng you don't know or ignore. For everyone is precious in his sight, chosen and cherished, loved, redeemed before the circling cosmos ever saw the light. He set us in this world that we might flourish, that his beloved world might live through us. We chose instead that all of this should perish, and turned his every blessing to a curse. And now he gives himself as life and light, that we might choose in him to set things right. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Father Guite.